Welcome to the Creative for Greatness podcast, featuring Voices of Justice, Then and Now, the podcast where youth explore history, challenge injustice, and connect to the past to the present.
I'm Noel.
And I'm Dakota.
And in today's episode, Education and the Fight for Justice, we take a deep dive into what it meant to fight for equal education right here in the North.
We're joined by the author Dr. Matthew Washington of The Jim Crow North, The Struggle for Civil Rights in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, a powerful book that uncovers a lesser-known story of Northern segregation and the families, students, and educators who stood up for injustice.
As high school students, we wanted to know, what was it really like to learn and resist in a system built to exclude you?
Let's get into it. To start, many people associate segregation with the South. What surprised you the most about how it appeared in the northern schools, like those in Pottstown?
So I think in terms of segregation, so generally speaking, when we think of the South, we think of legal segregation, more informally known as Jim Crow segregation. And so meaning that schools are separate by the law, there's separate restaurants, there's separate, just the system of Jim Crow in the South. There's this legal component where there's a system for whites and a system for African Americans. In places like Pottstown in the North, what we see in the book, I talk about de facto segregation. So it's not legally mandated, meaning it's not on the law books, but it's practice in various ways. So that's sort of a large theme throughout the Jim Crow North. So that could mean, to give some examples, it might mean, like, for example, African Americans working various jobs, they're not able to get into white collar positions, meaning like positions of management and so forth, but rather that they're working as laborers, and that's the highest that they can go. So these are some examples of the ways in which that Jim Crow Northern style or Jim Crow manifests in the North.
Can you tell us about any specific students or teachers who really stood out in this fight for justice through education?
So in terms of, I was thinking about this yesterday, in Pottstown. So, for example, NAACP President James Corm, so he served as NAACP president during World War II for a little bit, and then in the early 1960s. So there's an instance I talk about in the book where at one time Pottstown was thinking about splitting up a middle school. I forget the names right now, but essentially they're going to turn into two schools. And James Corm made the point. So the Corm family, Corum, they're a prominent family in Pottstown in terms of civil rights. James Corm, William Corm, Thomas Corm, and then their nephew, who will marry James Corm's daughter, Millicent Corm, who becomes Millicent Maribel, Newstell Maribel. So in terms of this splitting up the schools, it was going to be largely along class lines, so even poorer areas, and then many minority students were going to be split up into this school. So here's one example. James Corm and others spoke out against this, and ultimately it didn't happen. That's one example. And then there were students who went to Pottstown who would just play a role in civil rights activism more generally. Francis Young Williams is one example that I talk about, as well as Millicent, who becomes Millicent Maribel. She's involved in local civil rights activism. So these are just some examples of connection of local students who ultimately go on and will be involved in civil rights on the local front.
Your book talks about how Black families organized for better schools. What forms did that Whoa. You want to say that?
Advocacy talk take.
Thank you.
So in terms of the book, in terms of educational activism in Pottstown, I give an example in nearby Phoenixville, where there's local Newstell Maribel, and then even others are involved in a direct student sit-in. But in Pottstown, I wasn't able to find necessarily evidence that. Now, of course, the book talks about there's instances where. So, for example, one story comes to mind where in the Pottstown School District, this is right after Brown v. Board of Education, which was ruled in May of 1954, which declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional. So then there was a report that was completed by a Pottstown Mercury journalist named Norman Poirier. And it was called, the initial article was called Jim Crow Yankee Style Stalks the Streets of Pottstown. And in one finding that he found, so in terms of education, the schools were using a book called Little Black Sambo, which is a derogatory book that was being used. So it's a discriminatory book towards African Americans. However, once educational authorities were notified about the book and how it's demeaning, they stopped using the book, is one example. Another example, when I think of education, there was a local businessman where school children were on his property for some sort of event. And basically, the man said he did not want African-American children there on his property. So this relates to just these ideas of discrimination. So these are sort of the two points that come to mind. Now, just the Black community more generally in Pottstown, they're going to be involved in a variety of civil rights initiatives. But education, there are components of activism, but ultimately I wasn't able to find an abundance of evidence in terms of, now one more point comes to mind. So I mentioned Frances Young Williams. She will be active with the YMCA program in Pottstown during World War II and after World War II, where it was a program that catered towards the Black community. But she made a point, I think it was Frances Young Williams, she made a point where she remembers going to school and just the challenges that Black students faced, because many felt that they were not given the same opportunity. Say, for example, there's a program, I believe, from Pottstown High School where it would train students to go out and get jobs in the community, white collar positions like stenographer work or secretary work. And after Brown v. Board of Education, by the mid-1950s or so, there was not many African-American stenographers or even secretaries in town. So this was making the point that white collar positions, office work, managers were being excluded for African Americans. So there was not an equal of opportunity.
Were school segregation policies in Pottstown written into law, or were they more informal but still enforced?
So in Pennsylvania, more generally, Pennsylvania segregation laws in terms of education were taken off the books in the 1880s. So 50 or 70 or so years before Brown v. Board of Education. So segregation in Pottstown and other areas of the North was not legally mandated, but there was local practice which was sort of entrenched in local customs of discrimination policies. So it's not on the law books. When we think of like the South, we think of Jim Crow, we think of separate water fountains, we think of separate schools, we think of separate taxis, we think of separate restaurants. But in Pottstown, it's practiced more subtly. To give an example, during World War II, there was a local African American named Oscar Carter who wrote the Pottstown Mercury, Pottstown's local newspaper. And he made this point in terms of restaurants. He said, you could go in to sit down. You could enter the restaurant, but you would sit there and no one would serve you. And he said you would feel then so just ignored that you would leave. So that's an example of how local Jim Crow policies would manifest. He entered the restaurant, right, but then was not able to get served because of these local sort of Jim Crow customs. He gave another example with housing. He said if African Americans wanted a place to stay, usually it was in dilapidated housing. They were not being allowed to get into certain areas because of local policies. They're not on the law books, but they're just so practiced. So these are some examples. Then he gave an example about jobs. He basically said African Americans can only get jobs of the lowest pay of labor jobs. They were not having access to blue collar work. So essentially, to kind of summarize this idea that in Pottstown and other areas of the North, there's not legal segregation, but it's more so the ways in which Northern Jim Crow policies they're being practiced, the more customary, they're more just how things are being done in these local Northern spaces. They're falling in line with this concept of what I identify in the book as de facto segregation, or I also call it Northern Jim Crow policies.
How did Black churches or community organizations support students and families during this time?
So churches like Second Baptist Church, even just in civil rights activism more generally in Pottstown, Second Baptist churches play instrumental roles under the leadership of Pastor Haywood Butler, who's from Virginia. So that's even a theme throughout my book. We see the role of not only Northern African Americans, but also Southern African Americans in local civil rights. So many are migrating before and after what's known as the Great Migration. The Great Migration is from 19 to 1970, when African Americans leave the South for the Northeast. So places like Pottstown, Philadelphia, Boston, places like Detroit, and the West, Oakland, Seattle. So they're migrating a lot of times for job opportunities in Northern industry. And then they will make their way to places like Pottstown. They'll become actively involved in local civil rights. Haywood Butler is a prime example. Newstell Marable later on. But going back to the question regarding Black churches, Second Baptist Church under Haywood Butler's pastorate, he'll be the pastor there, I think, from 1938 to 1971. And he will play instrumental roles in helping with African Americans to get housing. He'll advocate for better opportunities for African Americans. Under Haywood Butler, there will be the establishment of what's known as the Frankfurt Improvement Association. Second Baptist Church will have a store that will cater to that community, a grocery store. So these are some examples. And Haywood Butler, he will be an activist in what's known as the Pottstown Civic League, which is also to improve conditions within the Black community. Also, Pottstown Bethel African Methodist Episcopal, Bethel AME, will play a role in activism. In terms of, there'll be an organization, an American Legion post of the Milton Sims. Milton Sims was the sole African American who was killed in action during World War II from Pottstown. And after the war, they'll establish this Milton Sims American Legion post, and that will play a role within the Black community to help with conditions. So these are some variety of churches as well as organizations that will be involved within the Black community. And also, it should be noted, a large point of the book is we'll see the ways in which white organizations, the Pottstown, when I say white, meaning white-owned organizations like the Pottstown Mercury, Bethany Recreation Center, which is owned by the local borough or Pottstown, they will play direct roles in supporting civil rights activism. The Pottstown Mercury is going to be the most consistent local white-owned organization that's involved in improving conditions for African Americans.
Did your research uncover any student walkouts, student protests, or youth-led actions in response to educational inequality?
So in chapter 6 of my book, which talks about the years after World War II, the NAACP disbanded by the end of World War II, but then it will revitalize in the early 1950s. So flash forward to the late 1960s, the NAACP at the time was known as the Pottstown Phoenixville NAACP, and it's led by Newstell Marable. So in the late 1960s in nearby Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, the Pottstown Phoenixville NAACP is going to play a role in a large student sit-in at Phoenixville High School, where 53 activists are arrested. 3 of them are adults. The rest are students in the school. And they're going to protest what they see conditions in Phoenixville where African Americans are not getting equal opportunities. And this is captured in the Pottstown Mercury. They will talk about the students advocated for 14 demands. They wanted a Black principal, Black guidance counselors. This was about a year after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. So they called for a holiday to commemorate Dr. King. They called for a course in Swahili. They called for more African-American kitchen workers at the school, some more workers, not only white-collar workers, but blue-collar workers. So these are just some examples. So they advocated for African-American students who were expelled from school. They called for them to be reinstated. So this is an example of particularly of a direct student sit-in that took place, not in Pottstown, but the Pottstown NAACP is involved. And there's other examples even of educational activism. Right after World War II, the Pottstown Mercury plays a direct role in helping what was known at the time as Pine Forge Institute, modern day Pine Forge Academy, to be established in the area. The Pottstown Mercury advocated for Pine Forge Academy in the modern day, at the time known as Pine Forge Institute. It's an historically Black African-American Seventh-day Adventist school. So they helped with advocacy there as well. Also, another example, in the early 1960s, there was an instance in Pine Forge in the local elementary school, so of the public school, where the Pottstown Mercury advocated for several African-American children to be able to go to school there. This happened in the early 1960s.
Mm-hmm. How did unequal education affect the life chances of Black students in Pottstown after graduation?
So this probably goes to the premise of this idea of not being able to get into management or white collar positions. So, for example, right after Brown v. Board of Education, Norman Poirier, the Pottstown Mercury journalist, he reported on a Pottstown high school graduate named Jesse Matthews. Jesse Matthews will go to what's known in the modern day as Kutztown University. And then I believe she also has a library. She goes for her master's in library science in a school, I want to say in Illinois. And she graduated from Pottstown with high honors, many honors. And there was a lot of articles that were talked about from Norman Poirier and others where they said, if Jesse Matthews goes and gets, a college degree, will she be able to come back to Pottstown and teach? Will she be able to work in essentially a white collar position? So they were calling out this unequal opportunities for African-American students. In the 1960s, Pottstown was an industrial borough at that time. In the 1960s, for example, there was one statistic where it had many factories, but it had there was 20,000 people on payroll. So it was a very prosperous industrial area. Newstone Marable talked about the conditions of Black workers. And he said, now I'm using his language, he talked about how there was tokenism taking place, meaning few Blacks would get into white collar positions, but it wasn't the norm. So he said most were being shut out of opportunities for advancement in their jobs, but they were relegated to lower working class job opportunities, essentially laborers and janitorial work, but they weren't getting equal access in terms of opportunities for growth in the company, for management, and so forth. So these are some examples of how we could say that there's this unequal opportunity in the workforce, even for those who are graduating from school and going into the workforce in the Pottstown area.
Do you believe today's schools still carry some of the same inequalities from that era?
So I'm not a scholar of modern sort of education and so forth, but there's been studies done that talk about lack of opportunity in various places in terms of schools and of funding and so forth. So there's definitely, I think with a book like mine, you can definitely see parallels in terms of opportunities, whether it's educational. I think you could draw connections in that way.
Mm. If you could ask one of those young students from the 50s or 60s a question today, what would it be?
So that's definitely a good question. I think in terms of just a researcher, I would like to be able to hear what their every experience was in terms of going to school in the local area or just their everyday experience in general. I was able to locate some sources, newspaper articles they wrote into what's known as it was a letter to the editor section, where they would talk about some of their experiences. But it would have been nice to perhaps not only interview some of the students, but also if they left behind like letters, diaries, just to kind of, because a lot of times when you're reading like a letter or diary, so if someone's printing a newspaper, they know that it's being printed to the public. But a letter or diary is it's more personal, where they're documents, so they might be more transparent, right, in their experiences. So that's where with those documents as a historian, you're able to then paint a further picture of what they're going through and so forth. So that would be just from a researcher standpoint, I would be interested to see if their experience aligned with the materials that were utilized for the book. And I'm not criticizing the materials I use for the book. They're primary sources, they're firsthand accounts of the time, but just to be able to corroborate their sources, just from a researcher's perspective, I'd have been interested to see how their experiences related to the what the book talks about.
What advice would you give to students like us who want to stand up against injustice in our own schools?
Well, I guess, I think just the path of education, I would encourage students to say if they have an interest in whether it's modern educational policies or if they're interested in history of education policies, I would say to just really to start the process of getting into the research and start to see what the literature says. And then if that leads to even further study of say if the literature or the research says something, and then you start wanting to study it yourself and you find there's different conclusions. So I think the process of education can be beneficial. Even like with my book, I'm thankful for all the research done on Pottstown up until this time, and I was able to just bring in another perspective in terms of the history of Pottstown more broadly. But I would encourage that in terms of students just to go in depth with research and study them out and so forth. I think that's sort of an excellent way to kind of get into those pathways.
We'd just like to take a moment to say thank you so much for joining us and for shedding light on the education fight in the Jim Crow North.
Yes, thank you for your time.
Thank you.